AskReddit. What's the most horrible way to die that you've ever heard of that has actually happened? Serious NSFW. There was a comment on here about a worker at a steelworks who committed suicide by jumping in the molten steel crucible. Because it was liquid, he expected to drown in it, unaware that the density of molten metal is the same as solid metal, so he just skittered across the surface and fried to death. Brutal. Girl's hair got caught in a lathe and pulled her in. She was alone in the machine shop at night and the lathe kept spinning her what was left of her around until people came in the following morning. Not too far from where I used to live, a family all died. What happened was that, on their farm, the fecal lagoon had released a bubble of methane gas. It killed one kid who had wandered nearby. From what I remember, the kid fell into the lagoon, and then each family member tried to get to the kid, and they also were knocked out and fell into the fecal lagoon, where they all drowned. I read a story about a man trying to rob a place by crawling through a sewer pipe. He became lodged in it with his hands around his waist trying to squirm through a narrow part. The rats found him. Actually, just his face. They used his face as a buffet for days. There were a few dead rats around that he'd bitten to death because he couldn't use his hands. Other rats arrived to partake of the feast. He did not make it. This story is extremely disturbing and sad. Back when I was in 7th grade, I had this friend, Lazar, who was a year older than me. He had 3 siblings, 2 of which were much younger. He also lived pretty close to where I lived. It's important to note that we live on the countryside. One day, while we are at school, the principal and the teachers are freaking out. Kids are starting to cry. I asked one of the kids what happened, and I just stood there horrified for a moment. Turns out that Lazar's father was out on the field on a combine harvester working with his friend when something got stuck in the rotary thresher. Lazar's dad went back there to check it out, but after a while his friend thought that he was done and just decided to turn the harvester back on. However, his leg sleeve got caught up in the thresher and started to quickly pull him in, basically crushing his leg and soon enough, his other leg as well. By the time his friend heard the screams and stopped the harvester, both of his legs were ripped off of his body and crushed completely, only his upper half was left. His own son, Lazar, had to pick up what was left of his father and carry him to the car to get him to hospital immediately. His youngest child was there, watching all of this unfold, but I don't think he could comprehend it at the time. Having lived very far away from the nearest hospital, they had to basically meet the ambulance halfway there in order to not lose any precious time since his father, by some miracle, was still alive, though unconscious. All the way there, his own son had to hold him in his arms and wrap him in his clothing and using his belt trying desperately to stop the bleeding as much as he could. You can imagine how much this ducked him up. His father passed away a few hours later, if I remember correctly, and I was at school when this happened. That guy who jumped in a boiling geyser to save his dog also comes to mind. When they pulled him out, he had 3rd-degree burns over 100% of his body while he was still alive and conscious enough to realize he ducked up. When his friend pulled him out, he said something along the lines of, "That was stupid. How bad am I? I'm an idiot." Like, even though his nerve endings were probably shot pretty instantly once he was in there, the idea that he was able to realize that he was going to die is ducked up. I remember reading that they tried to take his shoes off and it completely degloved his foot, and that the boiling water instantly blinded him too. Horrific way to die. I'm outta here. Knew a guy in the Navy who said he saw someone get cut in half by a snapped cable. He was still alive for about a minute after it happened apparently. Severe radiation poisoning is pretty horrifying. It can take up to 2 weeks to kill you, during which time your body will fall apart at the molecular level while you're still alive. In some cases they can't even give you effective painkillers because your veins become so fragile they can't handle an injection. Oh, and just to duck with you, you'll start to feel better after a couple days, but that's just the calm before your skin starts to die. That guy that was injected with adrenaline and was skinned alive in a prison riot. My aunt died in a car fire. She was driving drunk and went off the road and crashed her car. A fire started and the car was damaged to the point where she could not exit. Firefighters arrived and one tried to pull her out by her arm, but only got skin. It's awful to think about. Similar thing happened to a friend of mine. Many years ago, when she was a toddler, she was in the car with her mother. They were in an accident and the car was wrecked. Her mum couldn't get out. When a fire started, the mum climbed into the back seats and cloaked her body over that of my friend's. By the time emergency services got there, the mum was gone, and my friend survived, but she was badly injured with burns over the majority of her body. Mother died a hero. Respect. That guy that got stuck upside down in the cave for like 2 days. I came here to post this poor bastard. The worst part was they almost had him out but then fucking dropped him, and he got stuck even more firmly. If I remember correctly, they pretty much did have him out, and he wiggled in celebration, which caused the harness to fail and sent him deeper down and permanently getting him stuck. BTW, he's still down there. They plugged it up with concrete though. Edit, I gave false info. The pulleys just broke, sending him back in. Not a celebration. I apologize. Dude tries to blow his head off with a shotgun. The first shot just blows most of his jaw off, but he lives. He gets up, walks to the bathroom mirror, looks at himself, reloads and finishes the job. That moment of looking in the mirror must have been pure hell. My friend worked on the liver ward at the hospital. If you are suicidal and overdose on Panadol/Tylenol, it takes 3 days to die in extreme pain. She said they would have people in weekly who had taken a Panadol/Tylenol overdose, and by the time they got to the ward they had changed their mind. So this person who now wanted to live died an agonizing death filled with shame in front of their friends and relatives. In Afghanistan there was a 12-year-old girl, 14 years old maximum, that poured gasoline over herself and set herself on fire because her parents were forcing her to marry a 60-ish-year-old man. Worst part about it is not being able to do anything to help her. A friend of mine used to be a crime scene cleanup guy. He was once called in to clean up a car where an infant had been forgotten in a car during the summer in Kansas, where it was well over 100 degrees outside. Cars turn into ovens. He quit after that. I was a volunteer fireman for a bit, called to a motorcycle accident. It was actually a classmate of mine that had crested a hill at about 120 miles per hour and ran into a disc tiller agriculture machine. It basically bisected his pelvis up to his ribcage and severed an arm. He was awake and talking, but died on the Mercy flight chopper. The cleanup was terrible. It was summer, and the heat baked his guts and blood into the pavement. There was a stain for 6 MOs where he was laying. I felt worse for the 15 years old driving the tractor as he was sprayed with blood, guts, and literally shit. That kid was pretty shook up. Or there's always being skinned alive. Aka flaying. Generally the victim starts with being left naked out in the hot sun for a day or 2 in order to get severe sunburn. If it's winter or just bad weather, a quick dunk in boiling water does the same thing. They are then strung up by the hands and a very sharp knife is used to make long straight incisions. The burn helps separate the skin from the underlying connective tissue. The skin is then peeled off from the muscle in large sheets using a hot knife. Between the burn and the hot knife, a skilled flayer could remove the skin with minimal blood loss, meaning the victim did not bleed out. Most common actual cause of death would then be hypothermia, as the skin is a vitally important part of your body's ability to regulate its temperature, or if they were super unlucky they'd die of sepsis, blood poisoning due to infection, as much as days later. And of course the victim would be kept conscious during the entire procedure. Since someone already said scaphism, my second worst one is strychnine poisoning. It can be inhaled, consumed, or absorbed through wet tissue, like the nose, mouth, or eyes. It causes your voluntary nervous system to go into overdrive, which makes every muscle in your body contract and spasm uncontrollably. These spasms can be strong enough to rip the muscles off your bones. If untreated, death usually comes within 2 to 3 hours, either from asphyxiation, your chest muscles spasm so hard your ribs cannot expand, or from sheer exhaustion. There is no antidote to strychnine, although if caught immediately you can be put in sensory deprivation on massive doses of muscle relaxers. If you survive the first 24 hours, you usually live. If